The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. In February 1943, as the sun bled over the dunes of Tunisia, the German Afrika Korps was retreating under relentless pressure from British and American forces. What had once been Romulus' proud army was now a broken shadow, tanks half buried in sand, men limping, fuel almost gone. But amid that chaos, something caught the eye of a German recovery unit outside Kasserine Pass. Something strange, something new. It sat there, motionless, half covered in dust, a tank unlike any they had seen before. Broad, angular, painted in a shade of green foreign to the desert. The German soldiers circled it cautiously. It bore a white star, faded and scarred. And yet, despite the heat and the sand, the machine seemed almost alive. No burn marks, no shattered armor, no twisted metal, just silence. Its name was stenciled near the hull, M4 Sherman. The Germans didn't know it yet. But this single captured tank, serial number USA 3,067,641, would become a ghost that haunted their engineers. Orders came swiftly. Recover it, study it, ship it back to Europe. The Afrika Korps, short on victories, needed answers, and Berlin demanded them. They dragged the Sherman across sand and mud, loaded it onto a transport, and sent it north, across the Mediterranean, toward the heart of Germany's war machine. The Americans had sent a message to the Reich without even meaning to. Weeks later, at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, south of Berlin, a group of German engineers gathered around the captured tank. They were the elite of the Reich's technical corps, men who had designed the Tigers, the Panthers, the armored monsters of Europe. They approached the Sherman with arrogance and curiosity, expecting to find a crude, mass-produced toy from an industrial nation that valued quantity over quality. They were wrong. When they opened the hatches, they found order. Not perfection, not artistry, but purpose. Every component, every wire, every bolt had a reason. The transmission was compact and efficient. The gears were arranged with a logic that seemed almost civilian. Too simple, one of them muttered, but as they tested it, the simplicity began to look like brilliance. The Sherman didn't need to be elegant, it needed to work. The Germans were used to machines that demanded respect. Panthers and Tigers so complex they required specialist teams just to stay alive. They were mechanical marvels, but delicate ones. A Tiger could destroy any tank on Earth if it didn't break down first. The Sherman, by contrast, was built with the humility of mass production. It didn't pretend to be perfect. It just worked. Inside the Kummersdorf workshop, the first tests began. Fuel in, engine start. The Sherman coughed once, twice, then came to life, a deep, steady rumble that filled the hangar. The sound wasn't refined. It was raw, industrial, alive. The engine ran for hours, uninterrupted. The engineers waited for overheating. It didn't come. They ran it again the next day. It kept going. No leaks, no grinding, no flames. The tank simply did what it was built to do. One engineer, an old veteran of the Panzerwaffe, wrote in his notebook, "The Americans build tanks like tractors, crude but impossible to kill." That night, as the snow fell outside the testing compound, the German officers met with their supervisors. They expected praise for capturing an enemy tank. Instead, they received unease. The reports from Tunisia had already painted an unsettling picture. The Americans weren't brilliant tacticians, but they had something far more dangerous, an industrial rhythm. Factories in Detroit, Ohio, and Pennsylvania were producing tanks faster than the Reich could repair its own. For every Tiger lost, 10 Shermans appeared. Hitler's generals had mocked this philosophy. Quantity over quality, they said, but the engineers at Kummersdorf now whispered a different truth. Quantity that works beats quality that breaks. By dawn, the Sherman sat outside, half covered in snow, its olive green hull gleaming under the pale German light, a symbol of something the Reich could not replicate: reliability. The same engineers who once prided themselves on the precision of the Tiger gearbox now found themselves studying a machine whose gears were unrefined but unbreakable. They took it apart, piece by piece, engine, transmission, drive shafts, and each time, their pride fractured a little more. The components were standardized, replaceable, and designed for unskilled labor. Anyone with a wrench and basic training could fix this tank. German tanks, by contrast, required artisans, mechanics, trained for years, engineers who could adjust tolerances by hand. The Sherman could be repaired in a muddy field. The Tiger needed a factory. As the tests continued, the results became impossible to ignore. The Sherman's transmission lasted thousands of kilometers without failure. The Panthers broke after a few hundred. Bearings, joints, valves, all lasted longer on the American tank. The Germans ran comparison charts, and for the first time in the war, they didn't feel superior. One internal report, marked Geheim strictly confidential, described the discovery as a triumph of industrial logic over technical ambition. The German engineers had built machines for prestige. The Americans had built machines for war. And yet, even as those findings circulated among the engineers, the leadership refused to listen. In Berlin, officials dismissed the data. They said American tanks were inferior, that their success came only from numbers. But in Kummersdorf, the men who worked the tools, who touched the steel, knew better. When they looked at the Sherman, they didn't see an enemy. They saw a warning, the kind that engineers understand before generals do. By the time the tests ended, the captured Sherman had earned a nickname among the German staff. They called it Das Gespenst von Tunesien, the ghost of Tunisia. Because no matter what they did, no matter how hard they pushed it, the tank refused to die. In that ghost, they saw their future and their defeat. The train from Hamburg screeched into the Kummersdorf testing facility under a curtain of gray snow. The war was raging far away in Russia, in Italy, in the skies above Berlin, but here, deep inside Brandenburg's forests, the war sounded like hammers, engines, and the hum of steel. It was Germany's heart of mechanical pride, a place where every weapon of the Reich was born, tested, perfected. And now, from the deserts of Tunisia, a new arrival waited on a flatbed car under a heavy tarp. The workers stood silent as the engineers approached. They pulled the cover aside, and there it was, an American M4 Sherman, green paint scarred by sand and sun, its white star still faintly visible. It was the first complete specimen to reach German soil. Around it stood men in gray coats, the brightest mechanical minds of the Reich, men who designed the Panther's claws, the Tiger's growl, the Maybach engines that powered Hitler's steel beasts. They came to dissect an enemy. Instead, they were about to meet their mirror. The first reaction was laughter. "It looks like a toy," one said. "Too tall," said another. "Too simple." They called it ein Blechbox, a tin can. They mocked its welded seams, its rivets, its plain tracks. But as the hours passed, the jokes faded. They opened the engine bay first. What they found wasn't elegant, but it was smart. The Continental R975 engine was straightforward, accessible from every side. The Germans measured the fittings, standardized bolts. They checked the lubrication system, redundant safety valves. Every component had been designed to be replaced quickly, cheaply, predictably. It was, as one engineer whispered, built like a car, and that was exactly the problem. German tanks were not built like cars. They were built like fine watches. Every piece interdependent, precise to the millimeter, but fragile under stress. A Tiger tank might dominate the battlefield, but its gearbox could seize after a few hours. A Panther could outgun a Sherman, but only if it reached the fight without breaking down first. At Kummersdorf, the test team disassembled the Sherman in layers: transmission, gear, train, drive, sprockets. They took measurements, checked tolerances, recorded every number. What they found disturbed them. The transmission gears weren't just strong. They were overbuilt, made of alloys that resisted heat and wear. The Americans had used herringbone gears, a design Germany considered outdated. Yet these gears lasted for thousands of kilometers without failure. One engineer, Oberingenieur Weber, wrote in his notes, "Our Panther transmission achieves 400 kilometers average before maintenance. The American machine surpasses 2,000 kilometers. Impossible, but it wasn't impossible. It was industrial." The Americans, the Germans realized, had mastered not just design, but production. The same factories that built cars for Detroit and trucks for farmers in Kansas were now building tanks, not masterpieces, but machines of endurance. They could produce 10 tanks for every one German equivalent, and those 10 tanks would all work. At night, the engineers met in the concrete lab beside the test field. The reports were spread across the table, covered in oil stains and fingerprints. They spoke quietly, almost ashamed. "They don't build for perfection," said one. "They build for time." "For repair," said another. "For war," whispered a third. The chief of the facility, Major Hahn, was less poetic. He slammed his fist on the table. "Our tanks are better," he barked. "Better guns, better armor." But even he could hear the hesitation in his voice. He had spent too many nights waiting for spare parts from factories that could no longer keep up. He knew the truth hiding behind the pride that every kilometer the German army advanced was another kilometer their machines struggled to survive. The Sherman, meanwhile, just kept running. They fueled it again and again. Each time, it started instantly. Its controls were smooth, almost forgiving. A driver with no experience could learn to handle it in hours. The Germans were stunned. Their own tanks required months of training. Gear shifting alone was an art form. But this machine, it was made for anyone. An American sergeant, captured in Tunisia, had once told his German interrogators, "You can train a farm boy to drive a Sherman." At the time, they laughed. Now, standing beside this green monster from across the ocean, the laughter died in their throats. Kummersdorf's corridors soon echoed with whispers. Reports circulated, stamped Geheim's secret. The findings were too unsettling to share widely. The engineers wrote of unprecedented mechanical reliability, rationalized construction, and exceptional interchangeability of parts. Each report ended with the same reluctant conclusion. The Americans had built a tank that Germany could not outlast. Outside, the snow thickened. The war was turning. Stalingrad had fallen. The Eastern Front was devouring divisions faster than Germany could replace them. Inside the facility, men who once bragged of technical supremacy now avoided the Sherman when they passed it. It had become a quiet accusation, a machine that worked too well. One night, Weber stood alone in the hangar, watching the moonlight spill over the Sherman's hull. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. He ran his hand along the armor and muttered, "We have built lions. They have built wolves." The lion was noble, majestic, but heavy, proud, slow. The wolf was lean, tireless, unpretentious, and it hunted in packs. Kummersdorf's head engineer sent a final report to Berlin. The findings were blunt. American tanks display superior endurance under prolonged operational conditions. Their systems prioritize durability and ease of repair. Current German models, while advanced, suffer unsustainable failure rates due to over-engineering. The document disappeared into a bureaucratic abyss. Months later, when Albert Speer saw the same reports, he would underline one sentence and write in the margin, "This will be our undoing." But by then, it was already too late. The Sherman was reassembled, painted over, and pushed into long-term testing. Its tracks rolled across snow and mud for weeks without rest. Each time, it returned to the hangar with its engine still humming. German mechanics stared in disbelief. They had spent years trying to perfect tanks that refused to survive their own ambition. And here was a foreign machine, ugly and simple, that refused to die. At Kummersdorf, the laughter was gone. The pride was gone. Only realization remained, and the distant echo of an empire beginning to crack. The first engine test lasted 3 hours. The second lasted 6. The third went on for a day and a half. By the end of the week, the men at Kummersdorf realized something they had never seen before. The Sherman simply refused to break. In the corner of the hangar, a Panther tank sat motionless. Its crew had been working for days to replace a cracked final drive, another casualty of over-engineering. Every time it roared to life, something else failed. A bearing, a clutch, a fuel line. The Sherman, in contrast, started each morning like it had just rolled off the factory floor in Detroit. At first, the engineers were certain they'd find flaws hidden beneath the simplicity. They turned up the stress, doubled the load, forced the machine through every condition they could simulate: mud, ice, snow, gravel. The Americans had built a monster of consistency. It didn't fight back, it just worked. They called in observers from the armament department, officers in black coats and polished boots, men who carried clipboards and arrogance in equal measure. "Show us," they said. The test began again. The Sherman roared across the track, climbed inclines, crossed trenches, powered through obstacles meant to cripple it. It didn't stall once. Not a drop of oil leaked, not a screw loosened. When they finally stopped it, smoke rose only from its exhaust, clean and steady. Major Hahn, the head of the facility, looked for excuses. "Perhaps it is luck," he said. "Perhaps this specimen was exceptional." Weber, standing beside him, answered quietly, "No, sir, it is designed to be exceptional every time." That sentence stayed in the room long after the engines went silent. Each test made the results harder to ignore. German records from December 1943 described mechanical endurance beyond expectation. The engineers logged every kilometer. The Sherman passed 1,000, 2,000, 3. Its transmission remained smooth, the bearings intact, the drive chain unbroken. When they opened it after the 10th run, it looked new. One technician swore under his breath, "It's witchcraft." But it wasn't witchcraft. It was standardization. The Americans had done something the Germans could not. They had built a tank not for one war, but for one purpose: mass deployment. Every Sherman, no matter where it was made, used the same parts, the same design, the same philosophy. The factories in Michigan, Ohio, and California could swap engines and turrets like toys. In Germany, every Tiger was unique, every Panther a handmade masterpiece, doomed to die in the mud. Inside the canteen that night, the engineers spoke in whispers. One young officer said, "If we had their factories, we would win this war in a year." An older man shook his head. "No, if we had their philosophy, we would not need to." Outside, the snow kept falling. The war was still months away from reaching Germany's borders, but the engineers already felt it pressing against the walls. The Reich was collapsing not from bombs, but from mathematics. The next day, the order came to compare the Sherman directly against the Panther. They lined both tanks on the same track, the pride of Germany versus the simplicity of America. The results were humiliating. The Panther stalled after 37 kilometers. The Sherman completed 180 before lunch. Its fuel consumption was lower, its controls easier, its startup immediate. The German observers said nothing. Only one, an old colonel with frost in his beard, murmured, "This tank is not beautiful, but it is perfect." The final report was drafted in January 1944. It ran 56 pages long, filled with data and diagrams, but its conclusion was one line. The M4 medium tank represents an industrial achievement of which no comparable German design exists. The officers in Berlin received it, read it, and filed it away. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda. Others feared what it meant, that their engineering, the pride of the Reich, was losing not to genius, but to practicality. At Kummersdorf, the tests continued. The engineers weren't ordered to stop, and so they didn't. The Sherman became their obsession. They ran it for weeks without major maintenance. It outlasted every expectation. When they opened the gearbox after a month, the oil was still clean. When they checked the cooling system, it had not leaked a drop. It was as if the machine didn't know it was at war. They began to admire it quietly, secretly. The same men who once laughed at American cheap design now used the Sherman as a model. Some started sketching ideas, small innovations for future German vehicles, modular parts, simplified layouts, standardized components, but none of it would matter. Germany no longer had the factories, the materials, or the time. Weber noted in his private journal, "Our tanks are monuments to pride. Theirs are monuments to purpose." By spring, when the Soviet front began to close in, the Sherman was still running. The engineers moved it outside for one last endurance trial. It crossed the frozen ground like it was born for it. The exhaust puffed white in the cold air. When they shut it down, silence fell over the field. One mechanic looked at the tank and said softly, "If we lose this war, it will be two machines like this." He was right. Months later, when Allied forces pushed into Germany, they would find the same Sherman still parked at Kummersdorf, engine intact, fuel in its tank, ready to start. The Tiger prototypes beside it were rusted, broken, forgotten. The Ghost of Tunisia had proven indestructible. The Germans had built the world's most powerful tanks. The Americans had built the ones that survived them. And for the first time, the engineers at Kummersdorf understood what that meant. The war of technology had already been lost. While German engineers were tearing apart the captured Sherman at Kummersdorf, across the Atlantic Ocean, another kind of army was at work. An army of welders, machinists, mothers, and factory men. Their battlefield was not a desert or a forest. It was the factory floor. Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Cities that glowed at night, not from bombs, but from furnaces. The endless rhythm of machines, sparks flying, steel roaring. America had become something the world had never seen before, an empire of production. Every minute, a tank rolled off an assembly line. Every hour, a convoy of trucks carried engines, tracks, and turrets toward the docks. Ford built bombers and car plants. Chrysler turned sedan factories into armor foundries. General Motors was producing tanks, engines, and even aircraft parts simultaneously. This was the real secret of the Sherman. It wasn't built by genius, it was built by millions. In America, there was no romance in engineering, only results. The M4 Sherman was born from that philosophy. It didn't need to be beautiful or revolutionary. It needed to start every morning, roll over mud and fire without failing. And that's exactly what it did. At the Ford plant in Michigan, a foreman could glance across the assembly line and see dozens of tanks moving forward like clockwork. Each part clicked into place with precision, not because of craftsmanship, but because every component was identical. One bolt from one state fit the same socket as another made 1,000 miles away. That was the miracle of standardization, the quiet genius behind American power. A machinist in Cleveland didn't know he was building a tank that would fight in Normandy. A woman in California tightening a hydraulic valve didn't know it would end up on a Sherman in Italy. None of them saw the battlefield, but they were winning it day after day, with every turn of a wrench. Back in Germany, the engineers at Kummersdorf studied their reports and tried to understand how such precision could exist in a machine so simple. They had spent years building the Panther and Tiger with the care of artisans, parts fitted by hand, tolerances measured to perfection. One American factory could produce in a month what Germany needed a year to complete. When Albert Speer read that figure, he called it industrial sorcery. And it wasn't just the factories. It was the mindset. America had learned from the Great Depression that survival depended on efficiency. The nation had spent decades perfecting the automobile, the assembly line, the mass-produced engine. When the war came, the tools of peace became the weapons of victory. In 1943, President Roosevelt visited the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit. As he watched the endless line of Shermans move forward, he smiled and said, "This is how democracy fights, not with one perfect weapon, but with thousands of reliable ones." The Germans couldn't understand it. Their engineers had pride. Their workers had skill. But they didn't have scale. Each Panther that reached the front was already exhausted by the time it arrived. Broken bearings, worn gears, fragile drive shafts, all born from over-designs. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for endurance. Its parts didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be replaceable. An American mechanic could fix a damaged Sherman in the field using a crowbar and a hammer. A German Tiger needed a factory, a train, and a team of specialists. That difference between repair and replacement was the real line between victory and defeat. The engineers at Kummersdorf realized it too late. Their country's obsession with technical superiority had blinded it to the future. They were building machines for trophies. The Americans were building machines for war. Somewhere in Detroit, a factory whistle blew. Another shift began. More tanks rolled out. Each one almost identical to the last, but each one carrying a little more hope for the soldiers who would drive it. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 2,000 Shermans every month. Germany could barely make 150 Panthers. The math was merciless. For every German tank destroyed, there were 5 waiting to replace it. In Berlin, the numbers reached Hitler's desk. He dismissed them. He called them lies, exaggerations. Quality will win, he said. but his words were echoes in an empty hall. His empire was already being buried under an avalanche of steel and smoke from across the ocean. Meanwhile, in the Kummersdorf testing bay, the Sherman still ran. Its engine had been running for weeks now, through snow and rain, with little more than refueling. The engineers were exhausted, their faces gray from sleepless nights, but they couldn't stop. They had to understand. How could something so crude, so unsophisticated, endure so perfectly? It wasn't the design alone. It was the system behind it, the invisible machinery of industry. America's genius was not in invention, but in repetition. The same way it had built cars for families, it now built tanks for armies. And just like those cars, they would carry men across vast distances, only this time into history. Weber wrote in his diary, "The Americans have built a war that can be repaired faster than it can be destroyed. That is their true weapon." When the German engineers sent their final analysis to Berlin, the report was short. It spoke not of steel or guns, but of philosophy. Our tanks are made to be admired. Theirs are made to win. By spring, the roar of the American factories had become the soundtrack of victory across the Atlantic. The men and women who worked on those lines never saw the faces of the soldiers they saved, but history would remember them all the same. Because in the end, it wasn't the tank that beat Germany, it was the factory that built it. By the summer of 1944, the roar of engines had replaced the sound of peace across Europe. The Allies were pushing inland from Normandy, carving through the French countryside, one hedgerow at a time. And at the tip of that advance rolled an army of olive green machines, the M4 Shermans. They came in waves, hundreds of them, clattering down muddy roads and through shattered villages. Soldiers gave them nicknames: Honey, Ronson, War Daddy. To the Germans, they were simply the swarms, because for every one that burned, two more seemed to take its place. On paper, the Sherman should have lost every fight. The German Panthers and Tigers could kill it from 2 kilometers away. Their guns were longer, their armor thicker, their silhouettes lower. The Sherman was taller, thinner, less powerful. But it had one weapon the Germans couldn't see: numbers. War had become a contest of endurance, not elegance. A German tank crew might destroy 3 Shermans in a single engagement, but they rarely survived the 4th. The Americans had learned to fight like their machines, not with perfection, but with persistence. The tactic was brutal and simple: mobility, coordination, communication. While one tank drew fire, 2 others flanked. When one broke down, the rest kept moving. The Sherman wasn't invincible, but it was always there. At the Kummersdorf facility months earlier, engineers had written that the Sherman's strength was reliability. On the battlefield, that prophecy came true. Panthers often failed before they even reached combat. Final drives snapped. Engines overheated. Fuel lines froze in winter and leaked in summer. German commanders complained that half their tanks were dead without a single shot fired. Meanwhile, the Shermans just ran. Mechanics followed the advance in supply trucks, carrying spare parts like puzzle pieces, transmissions, track links, engines, all interchangeable. A broken Sherman could be repaired in hours, sometimes minutes. When a Panther broke down, it stayed broken. The difference was devastating. In the field near St. Lay, an American unit replaced the engine of a Sherman overnight under moonlight. By dawn, it was back in the fight. Across the valley, 3 German tanks sat abandoned, their crews walking home on foot. For every Tiger that roared, 20 Shermans replied. The German tank crews fought with courage and skill, but they were trapped inside a failing system. Their tanks were heavy, magnificent, but they consumed fuel faster than the Reich could supply it. Their armor required materials that factories could no longer produce. Every repair demanded parts that didn't exist. The very strength of German engineering had become its weakness. By late 1944, as the Allies approached the Siegfried Line, the truth became undeniable. The Sherman wasn't supposed to be the best, it was supposed to be enough. And that, in war, was perfection. The Allied command understood the equation. They didn't need to build better tanks, they needed to build tanks faster. The Sherman became a symbol of unstoppable motion. When one column was destroyed, another rolled through the smoke before the fire cooled. German troops started calling them Heuschrecken, the locusts, because they appeared in waves too dense to stop. In the Ardennes, when Hitler launched his final counteroffensive that winter, thousands of Shermans met him heading. The forests filled with the echo of engines and the crack of steel. The Tiger and Panther still terrified their opponents. But even the best German crews couldn't fight numbers that never ended. A single Tiger could kill 15 Shermans, but when the 16th appeared, it was over. The U.S. Army's philosophy had become its strategy. Don't fight perfection, exhaust it. Behind the front, the logistical machine of the Allies never slept. Trains brought new tanks from ports, ships carried replacements from America. Men who'd never seen combat back home built the next wave of machines that would fight it. The war had become industrial math, and the numbers didn't lie. Even German generals began to admit it privately. General Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, wrote in his diary, "We have built tanks that win battles, but the enemy builds tanks that win wars." By 1945, the mighty Panther, the pride of German design, was operating at less than 40% readiness. In contrast, Allied tank divisions routinely reported over 90%. Reliability had become a weapon more powerful than any cannon. On the battlefield, soldiers didn't think about philosophy or industry. They thought about survival. And when a Sherman's engine roared to life in the freezing dawn, when it rolled forward through mud and shell fire, the men inside knew they could trust it. That was all that mattered. In one report from the Ardennes, a German commander described the frustration with bitter admiration. "We kill them by the dozens, yet they keep coming. They are not tanks, they are ghosts." He was right. The Sherman had become the ghost of every broken German tank, the living proof of what those engineers at Kummersdorf had already seen, that the war was no longer about who built the best machine, but who built the right one. As spring approached, the Reich was collapsing, and its armored divisions were dying with it. The few Panthers, still running, limped backward toward the Rhine, their engines coughing, their crews desperate. The Sherman rolled past them, smoke rising behind it, treads grinding forward into history. It was never supposed to be legendary. But legends are not chosen, they are earned by endurance. And by the time Germany fell, the Sherman was everywhere, on every road, in every city, carrying the weight of a world that refused to surrender. The war of machines was over. The war of numbers had been won. Berlin, January 1945. The city that once glowed with parades now shivers under snow and silence. The war has turned, and everyone knows it, except the man in the bunker. Reports pile up on polished desks, stamped Geheim, Streng, Vertraulich, secret, highly confidential. They carry no victories, only numbers. At the top of those reports sits a name that keeps reappearing. M4 Sherman. The Kummersdorf engineers had done their work months ago. They had tested, measured, and documented every failure of German design, every success of the captured American tank. Those findings were meant to guide improvement. Instead, they became evidence of failure. And in the Third Reich, failure was not to be spoken of. The report from December 1944 was the most damning of all. It came from the Panzer Commission, the Armored Warfare Council, now reduced to crisis management. Their data painted a picture too ugly for propaganda to erase. In a single month, more than 500 Panzer for final drives failed. 370 Panthers broke down from transmission defects. Over 100 Tigers were abandoned, not destroyed, but dead from their own complexity. Most of these tanks had never even faced an enemy. The Commission's conclusion was devastating. Operational readiness across armored divisions stands between 20 and 40%. The enemy maintains above 80. For the first time, numbers became confession. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, read the report in his Berlin office as the city trembled from distant bombs. He knew what it meant. The machines that Hitler had called invincible were dying from within. Speer wrote a private note in the margin, just 5 words, too perfect for war. Too late. When he presented the report to Hitler days later, the reaction was fury. "Lies," he shouted. "Sabotage. Our engineers are defaitists." He tore the cover sheet and threw it across the room. But tearing paper doesn't erase reality. The engineers at Kummersdorf, men who had once been heroes of innovation, now found themselves under suspicion. Their honesty was seen as treason. They had built the data that the Reich refused to believe. Some were reassigned. Others simply disappeared. The war had turned inward, against truth itself. But the truth kept running, in green paint and herringbone gears. Across the front lines, captured Shermans continued to be tested by field units desperate for anything that worked. German tank commanders reported that the American transmissions, once analyzed, were astonishingly resilient. One officer even requested the possibility of adapting Sherman gear mechanisms to German models. The request was denied. Unpatriotic. The irony was unbearable. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions were ghosts. Whole regiments existed only on paper. For every tank listed as active, another two sat immobilized in repair yards, waiting for parts that would never come. The Panther, Hitler's favorite, became a coffin on treads, its fine-tuned machinery collapsing in the cold. Soldiers gave it nicknames behind closed doors. Der Selbstmörder, the suicide machine. Meanwhile, the Allies advanced, their Shermans grinding forward through snow and smoke. To the Germans who faced them, they seemed endless. Not powerful, not majestic, but relentless. The same way their factories had been. In the ruined corridors of the Armaments Ministry, Speer's staff met nightly to discuss production. They knew the numbers. Germany could no longer even repair its own tanks. The factories at Kosel and Nibelung Werk were rubbled. The supply chain was gone. They could still build one Tiger, perhaps two, but what was the point? It was like forging a sword in a world of guns. One engineer, Weber, now reassigned from Kummersdorf, sat in that meeting and spoke softly. We have spent the war building dreams. They have spent it building tools. No one answered. There was nothing left to say. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, the last copies of the Panzer Commission report were burned. Officially, they never existed. But the engineers remembered every number, every line. They had seen the truth with their own hands. The Sherman had not just been a tank, it had been a mirror. In March, Speer sent one final memo to Hitler, carefully worded, stripped of emotion. Simplicity ensures survival. Complexity ensures defeat. Hitler never read it. The war had already become myth inside his mind, detached from reality. He still spoke of miracle weapons, of secret tanks, of vengeance. But outside the bunker walls, the only miracle left was the endurance of the men who fought in machines that still moved. In April, when Allied forces reached Kummersdorf, they found the testing grounds nearly deserted. Scattered papers, broken tools, half-buried prototypes. And there, under a layer of dust, the same captured Sherman still stood. Its olive paint faded, but intact. Its engine, when tested, started instantly. Nearby lay the remains of a Panther, its transmission torn apart, its hull rusting in the rain. The difference between them said everything. Germany had built monuments to precision machines that symbolized pride. America had built instruments of purpose, machines that symbolized endurance. In the end, pride had shattered. Purpose had survived. The reports they tried to hide were no longer needed. The battlefield had written them again in metal, fire, and silence. May 1945, the war is over. The Reich is ash, the cities are ruins, and the world stands in the silence that follows destruction. The forests around Kummersdorf are quiet now, broken only by wind and the distant echo of engines. Allied convoys rolling through what remains of Germany. Among the wrecks scattered across the fields, one tank stands out. Not a Tiger, not a Panther, but an American M4 Sherman, captured years ago in the deserts of Tunisia. It sits in the same place where German engineers once tested it, its olive paint dulled by time and dust, the white star nearly erased by rain. The bunker doors are open and sunlight slips through, revealing notebooks, calipers, and reports, the remnants of an empire that thought it could outsmart war. A group of Allied soldiers find the tank. One of them climbs up, brushes away the dirt, and peers inside. The controls are clean, the engine compartment intact. Someone suggests testing it. They refuel, reconnect a few wires, and with a low metallic groan, the Sherman coughs once, twice, then roars back to life. It's been running for 2 years, without maintenance. and it still works. The men laugh. They don't know its story. They don't know that this was the tank that changed the way Germany thought about war. But the machine remembers in its oil, its gears, its steel, the months of testing, the disbelief, the reports written in secret and burned in fear. The ghost of Tunisia has survived the empire that captured it. In Berlin, where the Führer S-bunker lies silent, Albert Speer writes in his prison diary, "We built weapons for pride. They built weapons for purpose." That was the difference. Across Europe, Allied mechanics repaired their Shermans with ease. Spare parts arrived by the ton. Within days, divisions are ready again. The tank that Germany mocked now patrols the streets of its fallen cities. The Tiger, once the symbol of power, is gone too expensive, too fragile, too late. Historians will later debate which tank was superior, the Panther, the Tiger, or the Sherman. But the engineers who lived it knew the truth. The war had never been about perfection. It had been about endurance. A tank that runs beats a tank that waits. A machine that survives beats one that shines. In the ruins of Kummersdorf, Weber returns one last time. His uniform is gone, his country defeated. He walks through the empty halls, past the skeletons of half-built prototypes and melted engines. When he sees the Sherman still standing, his breath catches. He touches its hull gently, like an old friend. The metal is cold, unfeeling, yet somehow alive. He remembers the laughter from the first day, how they called it a tin can. He remembers the night they realized it would not break. He remembers writing that line in his notebook, the one he could never forget. Our tanks are monuments to pride. Theirs are monuments to purpose. Now, standing in silence, he finally understands what it meant, because the Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a philosophy, a reflection of a nation that built its power not on perfection, but on cooperation. Factories, workers, mechanics, engineers, all moving together like gears in a single machine. Every bolt, every track, every engine part was the result of unity, not ego. Germany had built wonders that impressed the world. America had built tools that changed it. When Weber leaves the proving ground for the last time, he turns once more to look at the Sherman. Its shadow stretches across the cracked concrete like a monument, not to victory, not to defeat, but to the lesson that both sides had to learn, that in war, reliability is mercy. Years later, long after the world has rebuilt itself, that same Sherman, War Daddy 2, serial number 3,067,641, will be displayed in a museum. Children will climb on its tracks, tourists will read its plaque, and few will know that once it sat in the heart of Germany, teaching its enemies how to lose. Its story will fade into history books, its roar silenced by time. But somewhere in that steel, in the quiet hum of its memory, lies the truth that ended an empire. Perfection dies. Function endures. The lesson of the machine is simple and eternal. You don't win wars by building masterpieces. You win by building what lasts.